Welcome to the Whiskey, Jazz, and Leadership Podcast. Subscribe now so you don't miss a drop of straight talk you can't get anywhere else. We discuss the whiskeys to drink, music to listen to, and what it really takes to be an effective leader. I'm your host, Galen Bingham, the leadership strategist. Tonight's guest, author, speaker, and passionate advocate for women's advancement, Tammy Heermann. Hey, what you drinking? We are deep into the season, and I'm just going to tell you, I am just constantly amazed at how these conversations continue to get better. And I say we don't stop the momentum. We're going to keep getting better with this conversation, because I can tell you for a fact that this person that I'm about to introduce you to is brilliant, because I've had a couple of one-on-one conversations and was actually kind of upset because she was saying things that I usually say, only she was saying it better with research and with like more amazing analogies and anecdotes. And I was like, hey, wait a second. There can only be one leadership strategist in this conversation. We need to put this on whiskey, jazz, and leadership. And so with that, I have finally been able to go across the northern border and pull down Tammy Heermann. Tammy, welcome to the room. Welcome to Whiskey, Jazz, and Leadership. How you doing?
Hello, Galen. I'm so well. This is perfect. It's a Friday afternoon, and you mentioned the North, and it is the great North today. There's snow outside and more expected, so that ambiance does not disappoint.
Well, I have been looking forward to this conversation because you and I have done a number of projects together, and usually when we get together, there's like a group of us, and there's downtime either on the front end or on the back end of the engagement. So we're just sitting around chatting, and I'll tell you, the conversations that we had just sitting around the table, they were just so rich with information, so rich with insight that it was a no-brainer for me to try to get you on this podcast conversation and be part of this whiskey, jazz, and leadership movement that we've been creating over several seasons now. So I'm excited, and I got to get started with my first question so that my listeners know that it's time for them to start paying attention. The chit chat is over. We're about to get into this. And that question is, so what you drinking?
I am drinking, I made an old fashioned with bourbon. So it's made with Basil Hayden's Kentucky bourbon, but I made a Canadian version. So it has maple syrup from Canada that has been aged in a bourbon barrel. And of course, bitters and my orange garnish here. So cheers, Galen. What are you drinking?
Oh my gosh. I've really gotten into old fashions myself. That's kind of my go-to cocktail. Usually I drink my bourbons either neat or occasionally they'll be over the rocks, but a couple weekends go by and, I'll create one of those old fashions, but I'm going to have to try that with some maple syrup because you got me curious now. But yeah, I put in a lot of thought into the whiskeys that I drink based upon the guests. And like I said, every time I've talked with you, it's just been good, right? It's been very comfortably good. It's been dependably good. And it's one of those conversations that I kind of hate for them to end, but usually we've got to go work with a client, those pesky clients that actually pay us. We got to go work with a client. So I decided to go with Cassius Clay, which is a whiskey that was introduced to me by season 1 guest, Mr. Aaron Dickey. We call him Doctor, so Dr. Dickey. He's a Kentucky boy, and he introduced this to me while our daughters were playing soccer together. So there's always a lot of great memories when I pull out Cassius Clay. But because it's tucked in the back of my cabinet, I forget about it from time to time. But it's dependably good. It's always good. It's refreshingly good. And so that's what I decided to pull out for this conversation with the amazing Miss Tammy. So I'm gonna open this up. Hold on, it's just gonna.
Oh, I love that I'm analyzed against bourbon. This is, I mean, you could have like a new assessment business here.
All right, so let me pour some here. Let me pour. Okay, that's a pretty good pour for this because this is 100 proof, right? So this is grown folk stuff because we're not messing around. See, this always takes me back to those soccer games and hanging out with Dr. Dickey, and just great memories. So while I get into this and get deep into my memories, share a little bit with my audience, a little bit about your background, what you do, who you are. Talk just a little bit about this brand new book that you've come out with that I have gotten into, and I'm just loving even the first few pages. I'm loving your approach. But share a little bit about your background so our audience can get a sense as to what this conversation is going to be about.
Absolutely. So I've spent my entire career, over 25 years in leadership development. And I started working kind of in HR and training, both certainly in Canada, but also in global roles in Europe. And then I had the opportunity to build a leadership development function from scratch at a global software company. So that was exciting to kind of build it from the ground up. And from there, then I moved into consulting in almost 13 years at a big human capital consulting firm, where I started out as a consultant and then progressed to leading and running the practice. And a funny thing happened during that time is our president, our CEO at the time, kind of came to me and said, "Hey, my buddy has a daughter, and she just bought this business, and it does those women's luncheons and motivation. Anyway, she needs a partner. Make it work, Tammy." And he left. And so, of course, it didn't fit into our business model. It was a make work project for our president, and I thought, how do I fit this in? I'm not evaluated or paid against this project. And of course, what ended up happening is it became a passion of mine as I worked with women, as I got into the research, as I was creating, programs. And that's, really where it all started. So then I moved into a global role to really bring kind of research and speaking and programs to our clients. And then from there, I thought, okay, I've worked inside organizations. I worked in consulting. Now it's time to try this on my own. That was kind of the last leg of the stool. So for 5 years now, I've been exclusively focused on initiatives with women, for women, and the leaders that support them. So yeah, I've continued to work with global clients. That's always kind of driven me to really see what's common with women around the world.
The book is entitled Reframe Your Story: Real Talk for Women Who Want to Let Go, Do Less, and Be More Together. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I connected with, even before I could identify what it was when you and I would talk, is I got a sense that you were really, really committed to this cause, that this was not a job, that this was not a career, this was a calling, that this was a cause. And that's something that I can absolutely relate to, although I can't necessarily articulate. I can sense when that's going on. Help me with that, right? Just this idea that there's a point where it becomes more than just a job. It becomes more than a career. Has it become a calling for you?
It has, and I'm glad that you could feel that through the writing, and that's certainly what people say when I work with them. But what started happening? Let's pick an example. You buy a white car, and then all of a sudden you start seeing that white car brand everywhere when you didn't really notice it before. And what happened is when I started working with these women, I was having the same challenges myself. So I was going through the same things, having children, infertility issues, trying to get promoted, getting feedback, and all this stuff. And I was living the journey alongside with them. And then I just started to notice patterns. And as I dug into the research, I was like, oh my goodness, this has to change. And Galen, I know it because every time we talk, you talk about your daughter, and I just see the pride beaming from you. And when I started to notice the patterns, with my daughter as well. And I opened the book. I talk about, the stories that she came to. And I thought, how can she think this way when I do the work that I do? My husband is a very, we share everything. He's a feminist, he would call himself. And I'm like, how can she be thinking these things? And there's definitely a lot of work to do societally and culturally. And so, yeah, I'd say it has become more of a mission for me than just a job.
Yeah, there were a couple of things, and I want you to get deep that opening story, because that's what really captured me. I'm going to do a terrible job of paraphrasing this, but it's like you're coming home and your daughter is saying, when are we going to let dad be the leader? Because dad's supposed to be a leader because he's a boy. And, mom, why are you working all the time? Why aren't you at home, going to bake sales like moms are supposed to? And that would be annoying for almost any mom. But for you to be like this leadership powerhouse, to understand that your daughter is thinking because your husband is a boy, he's automatically the leader. I could feel the gut punch. So talk a little bit about that story, because that hit me. And I haven't been a woman, and it hit me. I could feel the gut punch. So talk a little bit about that story.
Yeah. So what happened was we were going for a walk after dinner outside, and she kind of pulled me back and said, wait, mom, daddy has to walk first. And I said, well, why does daddy have to walk first, like ahead? And she said, well, because he's the leader. And I'm like, why is he the leader? She said, because he's a boy. And of course, she was only maybe 7 years old at the time, so she doesn't know why she thinks this. But, I tried to question around, well, what makes you think that? And how come he's the leader? And why are boys only leaders? But she wasn't really engaging with me. And then 2 years later, Galen, it was unbelievable. We were in the living room just doing whatever you do after dinner. And she turned to me and said, Mom, do you know why I said daddy was the leader? Oh my gosh, she remembered after all these years, this conversation. And it's because we were on a camping trip with a number of families. The women were drinking wine on a little hike by the water, and the men took all the kids on a little hike over the rocks. And they came to a spot that was pretty precarious. And, the kids, some of them needed help kind of getting up the rocks. And what happened was one of the dads said, okay, I'll go first. And then one of the little rambunctious, boys said, I'm going next. And through that moment, she's like, oh, well, the boys go first. The boys lead. The boys walk in front. And it was such an innocuous moment. And yet it shaped, at least then, her sense of what leadership was. And so my point in these stories, and then I tell, more and more stories as she got older, she came home, and is there's these innocuous moments every day that we're shaping, our beliefs about these things. And I think as parents, we have to just constantly check in and talk about these moments because they happen. And we watch television, and what are these shows they're watching while the moms are at home and doing all the bake sale, and even though that does not reflect our labor force participation in North America, like women are working as much as men, and yet that's not what's portrayed on TV that they are watching. So it's fascinating, isn't it?
Wow, it's just amazing, and it really drove home to me, to your very point, just how many places your story gets informed from. And if you're not careful, if you let things go, if you bypass these teaching moments, you didn't have to stop and deconstruct that conversation, but it was an opportunity to check in and dig deeper. And so very often we will have things like that occur and we won't check in, because it really, in the whole scheme of things, is not a big deal. But when you have all these small deals stacked on top of one another, it frames what you believe or what your child might believe as being possible. It frames possibility. Again, that really captured me. How much of that do you think impacts how women in particular see leadership in their work today? I mean, moments like that when they were kids, how much do you think of that may have framed how they show up today?
Yeah. Well, I think It absolutely impacts it. And not just, on the home front, but of course, as societies and governments and cultures, we constantly reinforce it. So I did a really neat thing last International Women's Day. When I was studying my master's degree, I was doing comparative studies on different countries. And then I chose Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat, like almost 15, 20 years later, to kind of go back and see how things have changed in terms of, human resources strategies and impact on women. And sadly, not a lot has changed in those 15, 20 years. I don't want to get into this, but, the challenges specifically in the US with childcare and with women's rights and all of that. I mean, it constantly tells women, what their place is and what their role is in society. And then we even look to things like, places like Germany, and we think, oh, they're so advanced. And I mean, they had a female chancellor for, over a decade, and they're so advanced. And yet when I did the interviews, they said, well, yes, but what happens is because they have a generous 2-year maternity leave policy, and even the tax laws are created in such a way so that it's more beneficial for women to keep staying home. And the deep-seated belief, I was told, was that no, that still is the thinking around best for the children to be raised by the women. There's so much to change from a policy perspective and from a societal perspective, because it just keeps reinforcing this notion of possibility, as you said.
Yeah, yeah. So now your expertise, or a big part of your expertise, is not only leadership, but specifically women in leadership. But I found so many transferable concepts in what you wrote, where, yeah, it was written for women, to women, but I was like, oh my gosh, how is this impacting me? Am I doing this personally? And specifically, it was around how we create stories and we tell ourselves stories about what's possible and about what things mean. There was a couple of videos in particular by this guy by the name of Sadhguru. And he wasn't the first person to say this, but he was the first person I heard say this. He said, nothing has meaning until we assign meaning to it. And we have a tendency to assign meaning to things based upon our experiences, right? And if you're not careful, you can frame your whole sense of what's possible based upon what's happened in the past. When in reality, what's happened in the past is just what happened in the past, right? It happened. How significant is it to be able to identify data and identify occurrences and make sure that you're framing it in a way that's going to speak to your future, rather than framing it in a way that just reinforces your past?
I love the way you put that. I think fundamentally it's one of the most important skills for a human, but also in business, because we just don't talk about this enough with our folks in business. And it's interesting because in the sports world, in the any performing arts world, they all know that their head game is just as important, if not even more important, than their physical game or their physical performance, whatever it is. And so they get that. And it's led to, sports psychology fields and all of these things. And we go, yeah, that makes sense because, they're making X amount of money perfecting that shot or that move or whatever. And yet we're all humans. So we all have these toxic stories. If we can't let things go, if we define ourselves based on a mistake that we can't let go, like that's all of us. And especially in our offices and boardrooms and home offices and all of that. And so actually one of the most common and popular kind of workshops that I lead, I call it Master Your Mindset, like how kind of reframing can change your life. And it's because we need to learn the skill of, editing our stories and kind of reframing them. And so you've hit on one of my biggest pet peeves, Galen, is, so let's take the example of imposter syndrome, right? Most people kind of know that feeling that you're not good enough or that you're a fake or a fraud or whatever. So that is not female specific. And yet it has gotten saddled to females. And, the research would show that high performing adults, 85% of high performing adults will experience these feelings of doubt and fear and imposter syndrome and all of that. And yet, somehow women have gotten saddled with that exclusively. To your point, I think all of us need to learn how to say, okay, let's kind of deconstruct what's happening. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I acting this way? And how can I kind of reframe that in a different way?
I love the way that, again, I'm spending so much time just talking about your book because it was really fascinating. I love your approach. I know, first of all, I know how difficult it is just to write a book. I know the challenge that this is, but you've done it so masterfully because there was one point during the middle of the book where you're telling these stories and you're sharing these concepts, but then my writing instructor said it's almost like you broke the third wall and you said, okay, Galen, let's think about a meeting that you were in and maybe it went well, maybe it didn't go well. And then there's an activity and you're like, what story did you tell yourself about the meeting before you went in? And then there's space for me to actually stop and just actually answer that question. And then what did you say to yourself during the meeting, Galen? And then, Galen, what story did you tell yourself after the meeting? So it's almost like you're challenging me to really reflect on how did I live out the challenges that you just described to me that people face in a most recent meeting, and forcing me, challenging me to really interrogate those stories that I told myself. Talk to me a little bit about why it was important to not just share stories and concepts, but actually engage people in evaluating how those stories, how those concepts actually play out for them personally.
So you can't take the training and development nerd out of me. So I didn't want a book that just, had nice stories. And we all read those kinds of books and they're engaging and they're awesome to read. But then you kind of go, okay, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
So, and I wanted to have it backed up with some good research. But then I thought, but then you kind of have to do something with it. But so here's the thing. Here's a problem I have with a lot of the learning and development or leadership development is we just tell people, oh, just go speak up more in meetings, or here's a tip how to do that, or here's how to, go network better. And meanwhile, people are sitting there going, but Bob's in that meeting and he knows more than me and I don't know enough and he ruffles my feathers all the time and I just can't, And so we, before the meeting, in your example, we go in with all these assumptions and baggage, and then that leads us to act in a certain way. And then during the meeting, we're like, oh, is this almost over? And I can't believe she said that. And I'm so angry. And we tell ourselves stories. And then we wonder, why are we so bad in meetings? And why can't I just speak up more? And then we get angry at ourselves. And so the first step is always deconstructing the story. If you just tell someone, go and network better, and they're sitting there going, I don't know what to say, and I fear that what I say has no value, and I'm not valuable to these people, and they're more senior than me, and that's where the work is. It's not work on your elevator pitch, because you can have the best elevator pitch, but if you're not going to go up to anyone and actually say it because you're fearful of it.
Wow.
So for me, it's always the mindset first. Otherwise, the skills and the tactics and the tools are a waste if they're not in the right frame of mind to use them.
Hey, it's not too late. Hit that subscribe button so you're sure to catch the next episode. If you're really enjoying the vibe, leave us a review or become a VIP for guest and show exclusives. Cheers.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.